the hope of the skies. Burkina Faso, a country scarred by years of drought and hunger, had become a symbol of despair in the Sahel. For decades, the people had endured the harsh realities of survival, their land cracked by the advancing desert. But in 2025, something unimaginable happened. President Ibrahim Traoré made an unprecedented decision that would change everything. Instead of waiting for foreign aid to trickle in, he loaded military helicopters with 100 tons of corn seeds, sending them soaring across the sky to scatter hope over the barren earth. The helicopters, once symbols of conflict, now became the harbingers of a new era. Could this bold move of using war machines to plant crops transform a nation and restore its sovereignty? Subscribe now to stay with us as we uncover the incredible journey of Burkina Faso's transformation from a land of despair to one of hope. Burkina Faso, a country long defined by its struggle with drought, famine, and dependency on foreign aid, faced a challenge that seemed insurmountable. The Sahel region, with its unforgiving climate and shrinking farmland, had seen entire villages abandon their homes in the wake of desertification. For decades, the people of Burkina Faso had known the hardships of waiting for food shipments that too often arrived too late. But in the dry season of 2025, President Ibrahim Traoré did something that had never been imagined. On a seemingly ordinary day in the capital of Ouagadougou, Traoré, wearing his iconic red beret, gathered his military commanders. But instead of giving orders to prepare for conflict, he issued a directive that would go down in history. Load the helicopters not with weapons but with corn. In less than a day, fleets of both military and civilian aircraft were fitted with bags of maize, 100 tons in total, to be scattered over the parched, cracked earth of the Sahel. The operation, named the Rain of Hope, began with a thunderous roar as the helicopters took flight, the hum of their blades cutting through the quiet air of the dry season. For the people below, it felt like a spectacle, something they had never seen before. The military, once a symbol of force and fear, was now their symbol of hope. As the helicopters soared above, they released the golden kernels of corn which fluttered down like raindrops from the heavens, falling upon the soil that had long been abandoned to dust. On the ground there was disbelief. Villagers who had once resigned themselves to the misery of the barren land watched in awe as the rain of corn seeds began. Farmers who had grown used to waiting for international aid saw the sky transform into a source of generosity. Children, their faces lighting up with wonder, ran behind the helicopters, scooping up the seeds into baskets and buckets, their laughter filling the air like a festival. In towns and villages across the Sahel, people drummed, sang, and danced. It was a moment of collective joy, of something so simple yet so extraordinary. A celebration of life and the possibilities that lay ahead. International observers, summoned by curiosity, arrived to witness what some called madness, while others saw brilliance. No one could deny the audacity of the plan, and no one could predict its outcome. But in Burkina Faso, something profound was already shifting. The operation marked the beginning of a new narrative. No longer would they wait for the mercy of foreign aid. Now they would take control of their future, and it all began with a simple grain of corn. As the helicopters returned to base, the immediate effect was clear. For the first time in decades, the people of Burkina Faso felt they were on the verge of something greater than survival. They were on the path to self-sufficiency. It wasn't just about food. It was about empowerment, independence, and dignity. The seeds that fell from the sky were more than just a solution to a crisis. They represented a symbol of resistance to years of exploitation, a challenge to the international system that had made the country reliant on aid. President Traoré had made a bold gamble, but the people were ready to back him. There was hope in the air, and for once it wasn't coming from the West. It was their own hope, their own future being planted in the soil. But as the days passed, the people of Burkina Faso and the world had to ask, would this gamble succeed? Could corn falling from the sky truly save a nation? Could it provide the food, the stability, and the hope that the country needed to reclaim its dignity and independence? And while the helicopters had finished their work, the true test was only just beginning. Would the seeds take root? Could the rains come in time to nourish them, or would they wither like so many hopes before them? As the days turned into weeks after the initial operation, something extraordinary began to happen in the Sahel. Satellite images captured the once barren land now streaked with vibrant green. Where only sand and dust had once stretched across the horizon, signs of life began to emerge. Small, fragile shoots of corn piercing through the cracked earth. It was as if the very soil had come to life, responding to the generous shower of seeds that had fallen from the sky. For the people of Burkina Faso, the sight of green was more than just a symbol of agricultural success. It was the manifestation of a new reality, one that had once seemed impossible. The children who had played in the dust and dirt now watched as the first sprouts appeared, their eyes wide with disbelief. In villages that had grown accustomed to hunger, mothers watched their children nibble on the first ears of corn they had ever harvested on their own soil. The seeds from the helicopters had not only brought food, they had sparked a profound change in the very way the people saw themselves and their future. But the road from this moment of triumph was not without its hurdles. Despite the optimism that swept across the nation, doubts began to creep in from both within and outside the country. Agricultural experts, some from Burkina Faso itself and others from around the world, questioned the sustainability of the operation. Was this a short-term miracle, or would it collapse under the weight of future droughts, pests, and unpredictable weather? The Sahel was notorious for its harsh climate, and many feared that a single successful year of planting might be little more than a lucky break. International aid agencies, who had long played a dominant role in feeding Burkina Faso, found themselves on the defensive. Could they continue to justify their role in a country that was suddenly less reliant on their handouts? Some in the aid community were uneasy, arguing that the mass distribution of corn seeds might lead to chaos. Others suggested that President Traoré's gamble was more about political spectacle than real solutions. Critics claimed that while it looked impressive, it could not address the deeper structural problems that plagued agriculture in Africa. But within Burkina Faso, these doubts mattered little. The public's response was overwhelming, one that combined disbelief, joy, and pride. For the first time in living memory, the people were not waiting for someone else to solve their problems. They had taken matters into their own hands. One elderly farmer interviewed on national radio summed up the sentiment. "Our president gave us rain made of seeds. Even if half fail, the other half will feed our children. That is better than waiting for handouts that never come." This bold shift in mentality was contagious. Villages once burdened with despair now buzzed with energy. Where they had once accepted food aid as a necessary evil, they now saw the promise of self-sufficiency and sovereignty. The idea that the land could feed them, that they could nourish themselves with their own crops, was intoxicating. It was not just about food, it was about reclaiming agency, dignity, and pride. The process of planting the seeds had set in motion a transformation not only of the land but also of the people's self-image. International observers were divided. Some praised President Traoré for his innovative approach, hailing the operation as a groundbreaking solution to food insecurity. Media outlets reported that the initiative was a potential game-changer for Africa, a symbol of what self-sufficiency could look like in a continent too often dependent on foreign aid. The boldness of using military helicopters to distribute the seeds became a global talking point, with analysts marveling at the creative audacity of the plan. However, not all reactions were positive. Critics from the West, particularly agricultural economists and environmental groups, raised concerns about the long-term consequences. The very method that had seemed so innovative now became the focal point of intense scrutiny. Some questioned whether the scattered seeds would truly lead to sustainable agricultural growth, or if they were merely a temporary fix. Concerns about soil depletion, monoculture farming, and the lack of modern irrigation systems resurfaced. The environmental lobby in Europe issued reports warning of the risks of relying on a single crop in a fragile ecosystem, suggesting that this form of mass seeding could destabilize the region's agricultural future. Yet for the people of Burkina Faso, these worries seemed distant. They had lived through years of famine, drought, and displacement, and the immediate reality of green sprouts pushing through the dirt was too powerful to ignore. It wasn't just about the corn. It was about something deeper, something more profound. Hope. The simple act of sowing seeds had sparked a national awakening. It was the beginning of a new narrative for Burkina Faso, one in which the country was no longer the recipient of charity but a nation that could take control of its future. But even as the green of new life began to spread across the land, darker clouds were forming on the horizon. With the promise of prosperity came the question that everyone had been holding back. What if the rains didn't come next year? What if this fragile hope withered like so many others before it? As the green shoots of corn began to fill the Sahel, it became clear that the operation had sparked more than just an agricultural revolution. The scattered seeds had sown something much more profound, a sense of possibility, independence, and resilience. While the initial celebration and excitement were palpable, the true consequences of the reign of hope would unfold over the months and years that followed, shaping not just the landscape of Burkina Faso, but its very identity. Economic transformation. In the aftermath of the corn operation, the first signs of economic transformation were visible. For the first time in years, Burkina Faso was not just waiting for foreign food aid to trickle in from international donors. It was growing its own food. The success of the corn operation meant that families in rural villages were no longer dependent on aid shipments or food imports. Instead, they had the means to grow, harvest, and share their own produce. The economic impact was immediate. Local markets, once filled with goods imported from abroad, began to see a new product: Burkina Faso grown maize. In Ouagadougou and other major cities, merchants proudly displayed sacks of locally grown corn, and street vendors roasted corn on open fires, selling ears of corn to children after school. For the first time in living memory, the people were eating food grown from their own soil, and they were sharing it with pride. This shift had far-reaching economic implications. Local businesses sprang up to process the corn, creating new jobs and opportunities. Women, who had always been the backbone of family survival, found themselves at the forefront of the economic transformation. Many formed cooperatives, grinding the corn into flour, making corn-based snacks, and even producing corn oil. These small businesses not only provided food security for their families, but also generated income that could be reinvested into their communities. Some cooperatives used their newfound wealth to fund schools, health clinics, and microloans, lifting entire villages out of the cycle of poverty. Social and psychological shift. But the transformation wasn't just economic. The people of Burkina Faso experienced a psychological shift that was just as powerful. For decades, the Sahel had been a region associated with hunger, suffering, and poverty. Children grew up learning that they would never see the land produce enough food to sustain their families. But the reign of hope changed that. As the seeds took root and the fields turned green, so did the people's perception of themselves and their country. The notion of self-sufficiency, of being able to feed one's own family without relying on handouts, became a source of immense pride. Communities that had once seen themselves as victims of the environment and foreign aid now felt empowered, as though they were finally in control of their destiny. It wasn't just about food, it was about sovereignty. One woman, a member of a local cooperative, put it this way: "We no longer wait for charity, we invest in ourselves." This shift in mentality was not confined to rural areas. In urban centers, the success of the corn operation sparked a sense of national pride. Burkina Faso, once written off as a fragile state, now had a narrative of strength and resilience. The pride was visible in the streets, in the markets, and even in the language used by the people. A popular broadcaster in Ouagadougou summed up the feeling: "We are no longer passengers on a ship steered by others. We are building our own canoe, political and national sovereignty." On a national level, the consequences were equally significant. President Ibrahim Traoré had taken a bold political gamble by using helicopters to scatter seeds across the Sahel. But that gamble had paid off, and the people of Burkina Faso rallied behind him. His government's success in bypassing traditional agricultural bottlenecks, like the bureaucratic delays and corruption that had plagued previous aid efforts, had rewritten the rules of governance in the country. For the first time, Burkina Faso was able to demonstrate that it could solve its own problems without relying on foreign aid. This was a powerful message not just to the people of Burkina Faso, but to the world. The operation was a statement of defiance against the global aid system that had kept many African nations locked in dependency for generations. As Traoré himself put it, "They said it was madness when we reclaimed our gold mines. They said it was madness when we expelled the exploiters. They will always call it madness until they see it succeed." The success of the Corn Initiative had political implications beyond Burkina Faso's borders. It sent a message to other African nations that self-sufficiency was not just possible but achievable. Countries like Mali, Niger, and Senegal began to take note. They sent delegations to Burkina Faso to learn from its experience, eager to replicate the success in their own countries. The Sahel was no longer just a region defined by poverty and aid. It was becoming a symbol of resilience and innovation. International reactions and challenges. While the internal effects of the operation were largely positive, the international response was more complicated. Many aid organizations and Western governments expressed concerns about the long-term sustainability of the operation. Environmental groups raised alarms about soil depletion, monoculture farming, and the lack of proper irrigation systems. Some economists in the West labeled the operation as unsustainable, warning that Burkina Faso was risking its agricultural future by relying too heavily on one crop. The international aid industry, which had long been the dominant force in shaping Burkina Faso's agricultural policy, was now faced with a challenge. The success of the Reign of Hope operation threatened their role in the country. Aid agencies began to worry about the shrinking of their budgets and the shifting dynamics of global food aid. One UN official, speaking off the record, admitted, "We have never seen an African government undermine food aid networks so directly. It forces us to rethink our role." But in Burkina Faso, these concerns were met with skepticism. For the people, the seeds had already taken root, both in the soil and in their hearts. They had seen the impossible happen, and they were unwilling to let anyone take that away from them. But as the harvests began to grow and the pride of the people swelled, new challenges emerged. Could the transformation last? What would happen if the rains didn't come the following season? Could Burkina Faso withstand the pressures of a changing climate and growing international opposition? As the seeds of change took root across Burkina Faso, The implications of President Ibrahim Traoré's bold initiative rippled far beyond the borders of the country. What had begun as a national experiment quickly became a regional conversation and eventually an international headline. Regional influence. In neighboring countries like Mali, Niger, and Chad, the success of the Reign of Hope operation sparked a wave of interest and curiosity. For decades, the Sahel region had been plagued by similar challenges of desertification, food insecurity, and dependence on foreign aid. The images of lush green fields emerging in a region once defined by barren landscapes were captivating, and many saw Burkina Faso's initiative as a model for the future. Within months, agricultural ministries across the Sahel began quietly studying the Burkina Faso model. Delegations from neighboring countries visited the fields, speaking with farmers and government officials to learn how they could replicate the success. In a region that had long been trapped in a cycle of dependence, the idea that one country could take control of its agricultural destiny was revolutionary. Mali, Niger, and Senegal, nations grappling with similar environmental challenges, recognized the potential to break free from the stranglehold of foreign aid. The concept of self-sufficiency, of having the power to feed oneself without relying on outside help, resonated deeply. It wasn't just about agriculture, it was about reshaping the future of the Sahel and the broader African continent. Burkina Faso's success was no longer just an isolated achievement. It had become a symbol of African innovation and resilience. International reactions. Globally, Burkina Faso's initiative caught the attention of international organizations, both in awe and with skepticism. Organizations like the United Nations, which had spent decades coordinating food aid across Africa, were forced to re-evaluate their role in countries like Burkina Faso. For the first time, an African country had shown that it could feed itself without relying on the traditional aid structure. The operation disrupted the established global aid framework, forcing many to question the sustainability of foreign aid as a long-term solution. Some international agencies feared that the success of the operation could lead to a reduction in their funding, as Burkina Faso and other nations sought greater autonomy in food production. A UN official privately admitted, "What we're witnessing is a paradigm shift. One small country has taken control of its destiny, and it's forcing us to rethink our approach to food aid in Africa." The international media also responded in mixed ways. Western news outlets were divided, with some heralding the operation as a bold move toward food sovereignty, while others dismissed it as a risky, short-term solution to a long-term problem. Economic analysts warned that without a diversified approach to agriculture, Burkina Faso's reliance on maize could be problematic, especially given the region's vulnerability to climate change. However, a growing movement of African scholars, journalists, and activists began to speak out in support of the operation, arguing that it was more than just an agricultural experiment. It was a declaration of independence. The use of military helicopters to scatter seeds had symbolized the breaking of chains, an act of sovereignty in a region that had long been beholden to international powers. Global shift in thinking. As the story of Burkina Faso's Reign of Hope spread, it began to shift the conversation about food sovereignty on a global scale. In Africa, the message was clear. If one country could achieve self-sufficiency, others could too. The question was no longer about whether it could be done, but how to scale it across the continent. Even countries outside Africa began to take notice. In Asia and the Middle East, nations that had long depended on Africa for agricultural imports saw an opportunity to invest in the Sahel, forming new trade agreements to purchase Burkina Faso's maize and other agricultural products. The shift from aid dependency to economic partnership was a powerful statement not just for Burkina Faso, but for the entire African continent. But even as Burkina Faso's success became a beacon of hope for many, The world's most powerful players were not going to stand idly by. As trade deals with Asia and the Middle East began to grow, there were whispers in the corridors of power. Could Burkina Faso's rise as a food powerhouse threaten the global order? The success of the Reign of Hope operation was undeniable. In just a few short years, Burkina Faso had transformed from a nation synonymous with hunger and dependency into a symbol of agricultural innovation and self-sufficiency. The fields that had once been barren were now teeming with life, and the people of Burkina Faso, empowered by the fruits of their own labor, looked toward the future with newfound optimism. But the journey was far from over. As the country began to reap the rewards of its gamble, a critical question emerged. Could this transformation be sustained in the long term? The Sahel, despite the recent rains and the burst of green that covered the land, remained an unforgiving region. Climate change was continuing to shorten the rainy season and extend the dry spells. Could Burkina Faso's newfound agricultural model survive in the face of an unpredictable climate? Sustainability of the Reign of Hope. One of the key challenges that lay ahead was ensuring the sustainability of the agricultural revolution. The success of the initial operation had relied heavily on favorable weather conditions, specifically the timely rains that nourished the seeds after they were dropped from the helicopters. But what would happen in the event of a drought, or if the rains failed to come? Burkina Faso was no stranger to these challenges. The Sahel was one of the most drought-prone regions in the world, and the country's farmers had always been at the mercy of the weather. To counter this, the government and local farmers began to implement measures to safeguard against the vagaries of nature. Small-scale irrigation systems funded by the profits from the maize exports were being expanded. Communities organized themselves to protect their fields from overgrazing and pests. It was clear that the Reign of Hope could not rely solely on the whims of nature. It had to be integrated into a broader, more resilient agricultural system. Local research centers were also at the forefront of developing new seed varieties that were more resistant to drought and pests. This research would play a critical role in ensuring that the country's food security was not threatened by the changing climate. Additionally, farmers were learning to rotate crops, ensuring that the soil remained fertile and healthy and preventing the risks of monoculture farming. These efforts, though still in their early stages, demonstrated that Burkina Faso was committed to building a sustainable agricultural system from the ground up. Economic diversification. As Burkina Faso's maize production grew, so did the opportunities for economic diversification. The country's success in maize production had already led to new industries, milling, packaging, and even ethanol production, creating jobs and fostering economic growth. The export of maize, corn oil, and processed corn products had become a key driver of the country's economy. But as the country continued to grow, it was clear that relying on a single crop for long-term prosperity was not enough. President Traoré and his government began exploring ways to diversify the agricultural sector. The introduction of new crops such as beans, groundnuts, and millet would provide more variety and ensure that the country was not dependent on one crop. These efforts would also reduce the risk of climate-induced crop failures. Youth and women empowerment. Perhaps the most exciting aspect of Burkina Faso's agricultural transformation was its impact on the younger generation. Youth migration, once a massive drain on the country's resources, slowed dramatically as young people found opportunities to work in agriculture. A new generation of farmers, entrepreneurs, and leaders was emerging, with many seeing the future not in Europe but at home, cultivating the fields that once seemed hopeless. Women, too, were at the forefront of this change. Many cooperatives which had once been led by men were now dominated by women. These women not only played a crucial role in food production, but were also spearheading economic ventures such as processing, packaging, and selling corn-based products. The profits from these ventures were being reinvested in the community, funding schools, health clinics, and other essential services. For the first time, women were controlling their own economic destinies, and this empowerment was transforming the social fabric of the nation. Global positioning. Looking forward, Burkina Faso's success in agriculture had the potential to reshape its global standing. The country, once dismissed as a fragile state reliant on aid, was now a leader in agricultural innovation. Trade deals with Middle Eastern and Asian countries were expanding, and Burkina Faso's maize was making its way into international markets. As more African nations looked to Burkina Faso for inspiration, the country's position as a leader in food sovereignty was solidified. But with this newfound influence came new challenges. The global trade landscape was shifting, and Burkina Faso would need to navigate complex international markets and maintain its independence against the pressures of multinational corporations and foreign governments. As Burkina Faso's future unfolded, one question remained. Could this fledgling agricultural revolution withstand the ultimate test, the next great drought? Could the country's newfound self-sufficiency endure, or would it crumble under nature's unforgiving grip? As the sun sets over the vast golden fields of Burkina Faso, it's hard to deny the profound transformation that has taken place. What began as a bold gamble, one that no one expected to succeed, has grown into a movement that has not only reshaped the land but also the lives of millions. From the moment those helicopters first soared across the Sahel, releasing the seeds of change, a new story began to unfold, a story of resilience, hope, and the power of self-sufficiency. The people of Burkina Faso, once dependent on the mercy of international aid, have proven that they can take control of their own destiny. The reign of hope was more than just a solution to hunger. It was a declaration of independence. A small nation in the heart of Africa has shown the world that, with determination and innovation, it is possible to reclaim sovereignty over one's own land, future, and resources. But this story is far from finished. The challenges are far from over, and the road ahead is filled with both uncertainty and possibility. Will Burkina Faso's agricultural revolution withstand the pressures of climate change? Can it continue to thrive in the face of growing international scrutiny? And perhaps most importantly, will it serve as a model for other nations to follow? As we look to the future, one thing is clear. Burkina Faso's success has sparked a flame of hope across the Sahel and beyond. It has shown that Africa is not simply a continent that needs saving, but one that is capable of saving itself. The story of Burkina Faso is one of many that will emerge from Africa in the coming years, as nations across the continent seek to take control of their own future. What do you think? Can the rest of Africa follow Burkina Faso's lead? Will we see more nations harness the power of self-sufficiency to reclaim their sovereignty? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe now and join us as we continue to follow the rise of a continent reclaiming its future, one harvest at a time.